Hello, today I'm going to be going over an advanced reconciliation exercise which will finalize my 3-part reconciliation series video. I'm going to be going over multiple and complex skill sets including data compilation, data filtering, mapping, dashboard building, and data manipulation. And if you're able to learn the skill sets that I show in this video and incorporate them into your model, I guarantee that you will find efficiency. Again, the skill sets that I'm going to cover in this video are going to be more complex, so if you don't understand some aspects, I recommend that you watch some of my other videos which cover these concepts in more detail. And with that said, let's get into the exercise. We are required to reconcile the differences between the bank statement and the transaction statement, and then summarize the differences within the batch numbers. So now, before we actually go into the reconciliation details, let's quickly look over the data that we're going to be working with. This is the bank statement that has all the payment information by the different card types, organized by location and the date that it was processed. And the transaction statement also has the debit and credit entries organized by the creation date, the card type, which is under the payment method, and we have the store, which would denominate the location, and we also have the batch number, which was mentioned in the initial required. When we look over the reconciliation details, we can see that we are only expected to reconcile between the dates of September 15th and September 30th. We're also to not factor the transactions under the American Express card. Third, we're supposed to reconcile so that the transactions are tied based on the following categories, which include location, card type, and date. And lastly, summarize the findings of the reconciliation based on the batch number. For the additional details, we can see that the location code details are provided within the index tab. The card details are also provided there, and the creation date and the bank date should align, and do not factor merchant payouts from the transaction statement. And lastly, additional mapping tables should be created within the index tab. So let's quickly review the index tab to see what we're working with. We can see that first we have a location index, which helps us bridge between the bank statement location code and the transaction statement location code. So we can see that we have a location code of 22, which is bluer, and we can see that the transaction statement has a store code of the location. And we can use this index key to help bridge these two together. We can also see for the cards, the transaction statement has some card names that are different than the bank statement, and this is how we're supposed to bridge them together as well. Lastly, we have a batch index, so we can see that the batch numbers are actually organized by the creation dates within the transaction statement. And we can use these creation dates that are displayed in the bank statement to create our batch numbers as well. So from a procedure perspective, we have to first clean up the data for our bank statement and the transaction statement so that it is displaying the primary key of location, card, and batch number for both of our data sets. Now, before I actually start this, I'm going to do one quick data manipulation for our bank statement. So I'm going to create 2 additional tabs here, and I'm going to create a divider tab called Reformat. Now, the Reformat section is meant to capture the relevant components of each of our data sets. So as you've seen here, we can see that the reconciliation details expect us to exclude any transactions outside of September 15th and the 30th. Now we have the option of filtering this data set for all the dates that are outside of 15th all the way to the 30th, and then we can delete it and do the same thing for the transaction statement as well. But I actually don't recommend doing that. One, because if there's a mistake, it's very hard to have an audit trail of what got accidentally deleted. And second, if you were to have this file audited, the reviewer doesn't have the complete information to actually tie back to. So it's very difficult to trace back of any errors or the procedure steps if you just delete the data from the source. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to have a bank statement reformat tab, and also going to create a transaction statement reformat tab. And I'm going to denominate these as source. Now within the bank statement reformat tab, I need to first convert this data set from a table format into an unpivoted format. So essentially, I need all of these data points for our card spendings to be organized in rows as opposed to in columns. There's a very quick way to do this. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to create a table, then go to data, and then click from table range. And this is going to open the Power Query editor. Now this entire procedure can likely be automated through Power Query. However, there's a lot of complex data manipulations that we're going to have to go through. So I'm just going to use Power Query for a simple adjustment, and then close the data, and then do all the data manipulation within Excel. Now once I'm here, I'm going to select the column of the first header that I want to unpivot, hold Shift, and click until the end of the data set. I'm then going to go to Transform. Under the Any Column section, under Unpivot, I'm going to click Unpivot Columns. And this will convert the data set into a tabular format. This is all I need, so I'm just going to click Close and Load. And it will create a table for me. And let's also just quickly change the data format of this. So now we have all our bank statement data within a tabular format. So the very first thing that I'm going to do is insert a column, which I am going to insert a table column to the right. And I'm going to call this date reformat. And I'm just going to convert this date so that it doesn't have these time periods. And the way I'm going to do that is date value, text, year, month, day. And this will convert it into a date. And I'm just going to highlight this one blue so that I know that this is a formulated column for me. And as I've mentioned, there are several mappings that we're going to have to do. We already have the location, but I am just going to bring in the location here again so that when I begin formulating, I have a specific section that I'm going to reference as opposed to constantly switch between. I'm just going to equal location. And then next is card key, which is a simple XLOOKUP of the card against the index. And then lastly, what we're going to do is create a relevance key. And this is where we need to identify which transactions are going to be relevant to the analysis and which ones are going to be excluded. Now we have two criteria to assess this. The first one is that the date needs to fall between September 15th and September 30th. And the next criteria is that the card is not an Amex card. So within the required page, I'm just going to create a key for analysis start date and analysis end date. And this is where I'm going to document the dates that I'll be analyzing throughout this analysis. I'm just going to call this analysis period. Now here, I'm going to call this September 15, 2023. And for the date, let's just use this. And here I'm going to reference September 30th. So for the relevance key, I just need Excel to return me a specific value if both of the criteria are met. Here. So if and the date is greater to or equal to the analysis start date, and the date is less than or equal to the analysis end date, and lastly, if the card is not an Amex, I need this to return relevant, otherwise an empty. And you'll notice that this formula applies to everything because it's a table. Now you'll notice that majority of the data is still empty. However, once I filter for the dates that fall within the analysis period, actually let's add 14 here just to see if the formula is working properly. And you'll notice that all the dates that are outside of the analysis period and all the cards that are Amex don't return relevant. However, when all the criteria are met, we have a relevant key. And this is how we're going to filter specifically for the data set that we want to include within our reconciliation. And now we're going to go back to the transaction statement. And for the transaction statement, we're going to do exactly the same. I'm going to convert this into a table first. And the very first thing that I'm going to do is bring in location key. And again, I'm going to highlight this blue so that I know that I'm doing a data manipulation here. So for the location key, I'm simply going to look up the store code to here, back to our location key. And we are actually noticing some errors because some of the location codes don't have the ON code as the others do. So as opposed to just creating a location key first, I'm going to first create a store reformat. And essentially what I'm going to do is if is number search ON. Actually, let's directly reference the field. Then I'm going to return store, otherwise ON and store. Store is empty, then return empty, otherwise I want it to return this function. There we go. And essentially what this formula is doing here is if the store code doesn't have the word ON, then it will add that word right in the beginning. Otherwise, if it already includes ON, it is simply just going to bring back the store code that already exists. And now we can see that these 0049s and 48s got converted to ON 0048. And then for the location key, all I'm going to do is update the reference from the store to the store reformat one. There we go. And now we should not have any errors. Again, we also have to bridge our card key as well. So I'm simply going to XLOOKUP the payment method against the card key here. And again, assess for any errors. If at payment method equals empty, empty, otherwise return it. You also want to make sure that you don't have any zeros or errors within your outputs, just because when you begin using the filter formulas with these, they do get in your way. Now I'm just going to add another column here. And I also need to add the batch key here as well. As I've mentioned that it's best to have all your relevant details in one area so that you don't have to constantly move between different places. So before I actually get into the batch key, I'm actually going to create the relevance key. And for the relevance key, I'm going to be doing the exact same thing, where if and the creation date is greater to or equal the analysis start date, at creation date is less than or equal to the analysis end date, and the card key is not Amex, then I want to return relevant, otherwise empty. So I need to make sure that these references are locked. And there we go. And then lastly, I'm just going to create a batch key where if the relevance key indicates relevance, then I'm going to XLOOKUP the creation date against the batch key index. Otherwise, return an empty. Whoops, so it's not relevant, it's relevant. There we go. And then we're going to be doing the exact same thing for the bank statement reformat as well, where right to the left or the right, I'm going to create a batch key. The relevance key, I'm just going to highlight this red. And where if the relevance key equals relevant, I'm going to look up the date against the batch index table. So surprisingly, there are a lot of errors. First of all, I need to convert this into a general because it's a date. So there are some errors, and I'm noticing that it's because there are certain dates that don't exist within the batch key index. So it looks like these entries were missed entirely. So again, within the XLOOKUP formula, I'm going to specify if not found, investigate. And then instead of errors, we now have an investigate key. There's actually going to be one more thing that I'm going to be doing. So I'm going to add a column here and then call it gross amount. So it's simply going to just be gross credit minus gross debit so that we have the total payment amount. And I'm just going to make one more adjustment here. I did realize that there are certain merchant payouts that are still indicated as relevant, where in the required I mentioned that these are not supposed to be factored. So I'm going to add one more condition into the formula where the journal type is not equal to merchant payout. And once I've done that, the merchant payouts have been eliminated from the relevance key. So essentially, I just need to bring these into the transaction statement reformat so that I don't have to constantly shift between different tabs. So I'm just going to filter the gross amount section where the relevance is relevant. And it will bring in all the gross amounts there. Here again, we need this to be store reformat to. There's probably an easier way to do this. Okay. Card key. And then batch key. And now we have data from the bank statement and the transaction statement that are fully aligned, and we can use these to map against each other. And from here, I'm just going to add one more category, and this is going to be called the primary key. Now the primary key is going to be a concat of the batch key, location, and the card key. So I'm actually going back to the transaction statement, adding one more column to the left. I'm going to call this primary key. So the primary key is going to be batch key and location key and the card key. And here it is. And for the bank statement, we are going to be doing the exact same thing where we're going to add a primary key, which is going to be the batch key and the location and the card. So again, if you want to clean up your data, you can again specify if the relevance key is empty, return empty, otherwise execute this function. And here we're just going to bring in the primary key. Filter table primary key. And here we are. For the analysis tab, we're just going to organize this into two levels. I'm going to call this level 2, which is a more detailed one. I'm going to call this analysis tab level 2. And I'm going to first bring in the primary key. Now, the way you bring in the primary key from both sources, first, I'm going to filter bank statement where the relevance key equals relevant. And then I'm also going to simply just reference the transaction statement because these are already filtered for the relevant ones. Let's copy this formula, vstack, this one, and this one. We now have a list of all the primary keys, and then again, filter the unique formula on top, and now you have a list of primary keys. And XLOOKUP, we're going to look for this primary key within our bank statement. And you're going to notice some errors because there are going to be some entries that are within the transaction statement that are not included within the bank statement. So again, if error, then I wanted to return XLOOKUP B5. within the transaction statement instead. Batch key here. There we go. And now we have a complete list of batch keys. And here we are simply going to bring in details from the bank statement and the transaction statement. And the way we're going to do this is a SUMIFS of the bank statement for their value, where the primary key aligns to the one that we're analyzing. And then for a transaction statement, we're going to do the exact same thing. And then if we have a difference, from here we can see exactly which transactions are kicking out a difference. We are going to be using this data and creating a dashboard within our level 1 analysis to provide the summarize the differences within the batch numbers deliverable. So in order to do this, I'm going to create another tab and call this analysis tab level 1. And this is where we're going to create our dashboard. So we have more creativity in terms of how we want to build this. So we need to organize this by batch key. So we're just going to first bring in batch key. And we are going to pretty much just bring in a unique volume of batch keys here. So you'll notice that within our batch keys, we also have investigates, which include transactions that occurred within the analysis period, but are not included within our batch key index because it is not including September 28th, 29th, 30th. Now, I want to differentiate that rather than consolidate all the missed entries between 28th, 29th, 30th. So within this formula, rather than just return investigate, I wanted to return investigate and let's do text of our date where it's in the format of, let's do month and day. And let's just see how this turns out. Investigate and month and date. So we can see investigate here, investigate September 29th, 30th. And that's exactly what I want. And here, as you can see within the batch key, we now have a differentiation between the dates. So if we have bank statement, transaction statement, we can SUMIFS the bank statement based on the batch key here. So we can see that we roughly had almost 2.7 million in transactions from 28th, 29th, and 30th. And from our transaction statement, we can also do a SUMIFS of our transaction statement based on the batch key specified here. Difference. And we can see that our differences are actually not that material. And from here, when we would have to investigate, for example, batch key 776, all we have to do is just set up a filter within this analysis, filter for all the transactions that are not 0, and I'm just going to filter for the 776 batch key. And I could already see the 5 transactions that are contributing to this 91.3. And then I'll just go step by step to go through each individual batch key to assess the differences. And if you have to summarize a further level of variance from here, you can set up additional filter formulas and tables right below so that it brings in all the transactions that are kicking out a difference in column I. All in all, this is a very useful way to set up a reconciliation. I've successfully summarized the differences between the different batch keys and the amount of differences. And we were able to identify that majority of the differences are simply from missing the entries for the batch keys of September 28th to the 30th, and the remaining entries that are not so material in nature. And this concludes the 3-part series of the reconciliation exercise. This one is probably a lot to take in, but again, I do cover these concepts more in detail in separate videos on my channel, so please feel free to check that out. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out on my email. I hope this video showed insight to some formulas and functions that you may be able to use as well. And I'm going to be uploading more educational content, not only with Excel, but also job applications and working in FP&A, finance, and accounting. And if you're interested in that, follow for more. Thank you.